The Scottish political theorist and social commentator Andrew Fletcher once said, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I care not who writes its laws." Let me write the songs of a nation. I care not who writes its laws. He was talking in maybe exaggerated tones, but he was talking about the way that music really captures the zeitgeist, the spirit of a culture and a nation, and also informs it and plays into it. And that is so true when we think of jazz. Now, I'm a glutton for punishment, but trying to say something about jazz and the roots of jazz in just a few minutes is obviously going to be difficult, but we'll try and do that and try and bring in a few of the themes. One of the things that's really noticeable when you start to deconstruct jazz is the way that the groove of jazz works. So a typical groove in classical music follows on a pretty set rhythm. So you take a 4-beat, and the emphasis is on the first beat of the 4, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it sounds nice, regular, and we all kind of get the idea with that. But if you syncopate, that is, if you change the emphasis of where those beats fall, then you get a very different effect. So, for example, if you put the emphasis on the 2nd and the 4th, then you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it feels a little bit different. Now, better than me doing that, why don't we ask Jono to give us an illustration of, give us a classical kind of normal beat, Jono, regular. So there we are. So quite good for marching, good for classical music, and it gives a sense of regularity. You know what's coming up next. Now, why not give us a slightly syncopated beat, something that's a bit more offbeat? Okay, so you're picking up on that there's a difference there. It's offbeat, the emphasis on the beats falls in a different way. You could say that the jazz kind of beats are typically a bit more offbeat than your classical music. Now, think about harmony then. Again, we talk of a normal chord progression in harmony, or a classical chord progression, or one that you would have for pop, and Sam will give us an idea of how that kind of runs. So as you experience the emotion of that, you feel there's a little bit of tension in the chord, but only a little bit, and then it's nicely resolved at the end. And it fits the regularity. It feels nicely kind of concordant, nicely harmonious. But in jazz, you get slightly different notes being brought in, or notes you wouldn't expect in the chord progression, and I suppose it sounds maybe a little bit discordant and elaborates and increases the tension only for it to be resolved at the end of the chord. So again, let's have an example of a jazz chord progression. So again, notice how it sounds a little bit more discordant, but in a good way, and it's resolved nicely at the end, but it's doing, it's adding a bit more discord, a bit more tension into the music. So if you put those two together, and here's when the magic starts to happen, you get something which starts to feel quite commonly like jazz. So over to you guys. Brilliant. They've earned their break. Let's give them a round of applause as they take their seats. Thanks, Jono and Sam, very much. So let's continue with those themes and kind of now start thinking about where those came from. So why is it that jazz has these? It's got more than this going on, of course. I'm so oversimplifying. But why does jazz have this, this groove that is offbeat, that is syncopated, and this harmony which is a bit more discordant? What's going on? Well, let's go all the way back to the roots of jazz and come back with me to the American Civil War, in the midst of the American Civil War, 1862, 1863. And Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, that is, the liberation, the emancipation of slaves. But of course, if you know anything about civil rights history, American history, you'll know that despite the proclamation being issued then, and despite this being the thing they were fighting about in the Civil War, that the African-American people did not experience that liberation, that emancipation in 1862, 1863, nor on the heels of it on the back of the Civil War, 1865. It was a number of generations later. So imagine that you're an African-American who's fought in the Civil War, who's fought for this, who's pinned your hopes on this kind of liberation, and you come out of the Civil War with friends having died, and you don't experience equality of civil rights straight away. What will your experience be? Well, of course, your experience is of life being discordant, life being offbeat. It's thrown you a curveball. It's not what you wanted. It's not what you expected. Now, African-American culture has always been vitally musical. They turn to music to express their emotions, their experience of life, and they interpret their experience of life through music. And the marching bands had used many, many jazz instruments, as they were soon to be, brass instruments, to march people into war. So they turned to music to express their experience. And they picked up many of those brass instruments and then started to play on those. But the traditional melodies and the traditional chord progressions were no longer fitting for their experience because life was different now. They were experiencing life as being discordant, life as being offbeat. And so they turned, and I use the term technically, to their Negro spirituals, their history of laments, drawing on the history of God's people in Scripture, experiencing exile. And they started to express that in music and the very birth of jazz and blues. So you get some of these ancient blues melodies like W.C. Handy, with the words, if I had wings like Noah's faithful dove, had strong wings like Noah's faithful dove, I'd fly away to him I love. They're talking about their lament, their sense that they want to fly from this existence because life's not working out for them. But there'd always been a strong note as well in their music of hope. And this is one of the great themes of jazz. Yes, we have discord. Yes, we have offbeat, in it. But one of the great things about jazz is the strong theme of hope. And so again, turning to their Negro spirituals, they picked up on some of those strong themes of the gospel, of redemption, of liberation, of future hope. There's a song that we probably know very well, and some of us will be singing it in the autumn in the Rugby World Cup that comes from this. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Hear it, the redemption theme. Come and carry me, not transporting me away to a different existence, but redeeming this existence. There's the notion of hope. And so these started to be embodied in jazz music. Discord, offbeat nature of existence, picked up in the groove and the harmony of jazz, but this strong theme of hope. Let me give you an example of how that plays out. One of the great jazz musicians of the modern era is a man called Wynton Marsalis. He's a 9-time Grammy Award winner, not bad, and he's a trumpeter and a virtuoso musician. And one day he was playing in an underground jazz cafe, and there were a number of fans and jazz commentators and journalists there. And he was playing his signature tune, I Don't Stand a Ghost of a Chance with You. And it climaxes at the end of the piece with him accentuating those notes on the trumpet as it lingers in the air, with the audience expectant and silent. I don't stand a ghost. And then the tragic happens, a mobile phone rang. And one of the journalists who was sitting there writes on his notepad, magic ruined. He's ruined this performance. But then Wynton Marsalis does something extraordinary. As people nervously giggled amongst each other, like, what have we done with this? What's going on? He picked up the ringtone and he played it on his trumpet. Then he played it again. People laughed as though he was slightly mocking the person with the mobile phone. Then he started to improvise and develop the tune of the mobile phone. Then, with his extraordinary genius, he linked the tune and the melody of the mobile phone that he was developing into the melody of I Don't Stand a Ghost of a Chance with You. And he brought them together in this reconciliation that no one expected. And as it crescendoed, he ended on that signature line, I don't stand a ghost of a chance with you. And as the trumpet lingered in the air, people were stunned at the virtuoso brilliance of the man and the improvisation. And as he finished, they all stood up, rapturous applause. That, my friends, is jazz. That's the hope of jazz. That's the reconciliation. See what he did? He took something that could be taken to ruin the moment, and he redeemed it in a brilliant bit of improvisation. And it might not be improvisation, it might be the way the piece resolves it, but that gives you just a hint of the way that jazz works. And I think the reason that jazz has endured so much is because it's dealing with these big themes that we all deal with. Now, these are themes which Scripture talks richly about. We all experience a sense that life is offbeat, that life is discordant. We have that strong sense of it shouldn't be this way, it should be much better. And yet none of us can really live without hope, that strong hope that there is redemption, that there is a better day. And the Christian scriptures talk about the ultimate redemption being in the person of Jesus Christ. One way of putting it, I suppose, in jazz vernacular would be, he's the ultimate improviser. He steps into a world that's offbeat and discordant, and he takes those offbeat, discordant natures of existence, and in his peculiar genius at the cross and in his resurrection, he weaves them together to reconcile them and to bring about hope and redemption through his death and his resurrection. Let me give the final word as I wrap up to a fan of jazz and a rather famous person, Martin Luther King Jr. At the opening address to the Berlin Jazz Festival in 1964, he said this: "Jazz speaks for life. The blues tell the story of life's difficulties, and jazz, if you think for a moment, you'll realize that it takes the hardest realities of life and it puts it into music, only to come out with some new hope or some resounding sense of triumph." I put it to you, that's why we all love jazz.